Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the ARC of Massachusetts webinar series. Today, where our subject is on partnering with families working towards employment success. We have with us today Sean Roy, who's with Transcend and the Youth Employment Solutions Center, or YES. Sean is our technical advisor for a systems change project we have going in Massachusetts, excuse me, called the Massachusetts Partnership for Transition to Employment. So I want to welcome you and introduce myself, Carrie Mahoney, as your host. I thought maybe we could walk through a couple of the items to make this webinar a success. First of all, I've muted all of you upon entry, and the reason being is that we like to record each session, and the quality of the audio is that much better when people are muted. I ask that you use the chat button or the chat pane to actually ask your questions. We will be holding questions to the end, but that way we'll be sure to get your questions answered. And again, that the audio portion of the webinar is of good quality. So we'd love to find out who's in the audience today. So if you could use the chat pane and just let me know if you're work in a school system. Yeah, if you can just chat in your name if you are, or just say yes if you do work in the school system, that would be awesome. Okay, I want to make sure. Okay. All right. So I have one answer that a parent. So it seems like we've got some parents here on today's webinar. So if you can let me know if you are a parent, that would be great. Well, we also have somebody from the VINFIN's Employment Training Center, which is an adult service agency, which is great, and also the Ticket to Work advisor at the Mass Higher Lowell Career Center. All right, so we've got a mix of, it looks like we've got a mix of parents, educators, and also adult service provider attendees. So that's great. Welcome, everybody. So I'm assuming you can all hear me and everything's good. So Sean, I had to take your control away. And so I'm going to be giving you back the control and ask that you accept it again, and then we should be on our way. Okay, it says you're controlling the screen. So why don't you take it away, Sean?
Excellent. Thank you, Carrie. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I believe everybody can hear you okay.
Wonderful. All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Sean Roy, and I am with Transcend, which is short for Transition Center. We are a national disability training and research and technical assistance organization out of Rockville, Maryland. And I also, as part of my duties at Transcend, am a state liaison for the YES Youth Employment Solutions Technical Assistance Project. And so Massachusetts has a grant, the Massachusetts Partnership for Transition to Employment, and that is a grant through the federal government. It's called a Partnership and Employment State. So our Youth Employment Solutions Center provides technical assistance to Carrie and everybody involved with that project in the state of Massachusetts. And so I'm very happy to be here. Honored. A little bit about me before I jump in. I have only been at Transcend for about 2 years. Before I was at Transcend, I was at an organization here in Minneapolis called the Pacer Center. So some of you might be familiar with what we did at Pacer Center. It was a large national advocacy organization that focused on families. And my job at the Pacer Center was to help direct some of the projects for families around transition. And so I did a great deal of parent training, a lot of writing, a lot of presenting on issues of involving families and employment, both to families and to professionals. And so this is right in my wheelhouse. It's something that I've been talking about for quite some time. It's something that I always enjoy talking about, and glad when people want to hear how to better partner with families. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Let's see if I can have control of the actual slides here. Oh, I'm afraid it's happening again, Carrie. We're not able to advance. I'm not able to advance the slide. Some of you may have been on the webinar that I did yesterday, which was aimed more towards families, talking about their role in being partners in employment success for their son or daughter. And today, what we really want to do is talk to professionals. And by professionals, I mean educators, vocational rehabilitation staff, employment program staff, but also too, I think it's great that we have some families on board, because we're all in this together. And the ultimate goal is to get both sides working together, partnering with a common goal and a common understanding. And we're going to talk a little bit about what those are in a little bit. So I've got about an hour. I plan on about 45 minutes or so of content. We'll leave some time for questions afterwards. So today what we want to discuss is a little bit about understanding the power of high expectations and the role that plays, common challenges that professionals tend to face when partnering with families in these situations, key roles that professionals can work with families on so they can support their young person towards employment success, and addressing apprehension that some families might have to explore paid competitive employment, and then some key strategies for partnering. So what I like to start with is, and Carrie, next slide, please. What I like to start with is a slide that talks a little bit about foundation. Oh, so I see that we've got some people with some internet connection issues, and I have one person who says that they have no sound. If in the chat box, why don't you just kind of let me know if your group or yourself, if you can hear me as I'm speaking, just so we can make sure that I'm not speaking into the void and nobody is listening. Okay, so we got some people that are saying that they can hear me. Okay, all right, well, let's move ahead. And people are saying that it might be easier to use the phone number than the computer audio. But I'm going to move ahead and see if we can't get some of these connection problems figured out. The slide that you see is a slide that I've been using for a little while in some of my presentations for professionals, because when we talk about family engagement, oftentimes I think one of the barriers is that family engagement is ill-defined. We don't always know what we mean by family engagement. And so I wanted to lay out what I consider some foundational principles when we're talking about family engagement, some of the things that we're trying to do and goals that we're trying to reach. First of all, an understanding that partnering with families can improve outcomes. So we're all trying to achieve outcomes in some way, shape, or form. We're trying to improve education outcomes. We're trying to improve the number of families that come to IEP meetings. We're trying to improve graduation rates. We're trying to improve employment placements. And partnering with families should be seen as a strategy to meet the outcomes that we're trying to achieve. Partnering with families should be a core ethic of how a school or an employment program does business. It should not be an afterthought. It should be something that is trained on. It should be something that is an expectation. Staff need to be trained on how to effectively partner with families because not everybody has those inherent skills to be able to build those relationships and talk to families. And so staff training is necessary on some of the ins and outs of being able to build those relationships. I believe firmly that staff should be held accountable to the expectation of partnering with families. It is something oftentimes that I think is said in passing, but I think if we ratchet it up a little bit, the accountability, we would see a little bit more use of some of these partnering techniques. A great place to start is high expectation. Common ground, both sides conveying that they believe in what a young person with a disability can achieve, and those messages are being sent out on a consistent basis. But families need guidance on how to best fill their roles as partners. The families oftentimes, as I'm going to mention, they want to play a role, but they don't always know how. And all of this, the partnering, the staff training, the family roles should be focused on what the youth identifies as their goal in reaching that goal. So everything that we do should be centered around the youth being able to live lives of their choosing, and not just based on compliance or checking boxes or whatever. And we just sometimes tend to lose sight of why we're doing this, and it's to help young people segue into adulthood. Next slide, please. I thought I had control, and I clicked on the box, but I have I can't seem to have control, so that is fine. When we talk about family engagement, I think it's important to understand that there are kind of research-based impacts that we can point to say that, in fact, it is a strategy to help us. For example, students with one or more parents who participate in IEP meetings during the 11th and 12th grades are more likely to be engaged in post-school employment. Students with parents who have had high expectations are also more likely to be engaged in post-secondary education and employment. So it kind of stands to reason, if you think about it a little bit, that families who expect that their son or daughters will be employed or go to college or live independently in their communities are more likely to have kids who do just that. And if you think back on maybe some of the expectations that were placed on you as a young person, I'm sure that your families had those exact same expectations of you. And really, I think the overarching lesson here is that we should expect the same thing for young people with disabilities as we do for all young people. So the next slide, please. I've been doing work around family engagement, as I said, for the better part of 20 years. I've done training for professionals. I've done training for parents. I've worked with educators and vocational rehabilitation staff and employment program staff. Now, I understand that there's always two sides to every coin. And so family engagement continues to be something that is challenging. And there might be some reasons for this, and I'd like to go over some of those reasons why I think there are some challenges to family engagement and the two sides partnering together. So if you look on the left, there's the family perspective, the way that the family may look at it. And again, I'm using some generalizations based on my training and my direct contact with families over the years. Oftentimes, they're unsure of their role. They're unsure of their role in being a part of the IEP team, unsure of their role as being part of the employment process. This can be impacted by, being new to the country. So many people who, either English is a second language or who are new to our country are unfamiliar with the way that we tend to go about things. And so we have to really work with families to be able to help them understand what their role is. When I was an advocate, I took phone calls from families quite often. That was one of my jobs, as is probably, the staff of the ARCs that are on the phone or the Federation for Families or a lot of agencies in Massachusetts that take phone calls directly from families who have questions or concerns or who are seeking some help and resources in untangling situations. And I find that, the vast majority of times the trouble came based on a lack of communication. People were unsure what each other's roles were supposed to be. Families were unsure what programs were supposed to do, what they would do, what they wouldn't do, what eligibility was. Somewhere along the line, communication broke down. And that is where the partnering between them and the professionals really suffered. In addition, we can all acknowledge that the systems that we have in place for young people with disabilities to transition into adulthood and become employed and go to college and all those things, those are very confusing systems to navigate. They're very hard for people who work within the system. And then you have kind of the once removed layers of professionals that may not work in that particular system, but work in the area. So for example, educators trying to fully understand what vocational rehabilitation does. It's confusing. So think about families and they're, trying to navigate and understand some of these systems as well. I think that oftentimes we work with conflicting priorities. If families want something different than what professionals want, families really just want to know that their son or daughter, that you have built a relationship with them and the family, and that you are doing what's best and what's needed for them. And oftentimes, because of eligibility and compliance and stuff of that nature, the priority of the professional isn't always strictly just to help and do whatever is necessary. They are beholden to rules and forms and regulations and all of these things. So the priorities do tend to conflict a little bit. And parents with kids, especially kids with high support needs, they live very busy lives. And trying to be a part of this process oftentimes is challenging when you're also trying to maintain an income and get to doctor's appointments or therapist appointments, or just trying to keep your head above water as a parent of a child with a disability. On the professional side, partnering might be new. A lot of the older professionals that are out there never maybe even thought that dealing with families was going to be part of the job that they were expected to do. This might be a new expectation, and anytime you have something new, it can be a challenge. Communicating to families is certainly a challenge for professionals. Getting families to communicate back with you, getting families to sign the forms that you need them to sign and get to the meetings that you want them to get to, that can be a challenge. As I mentioned, the systems are as confusing for professionals as they are for families. And it's oftentimes, especially with high turnover, it's difficult to root your staff in what everybody else does, even though that's so important to try to do. We talked about the conflicting priorities, and we also know that professionals experience not having enough time in their day. Caseloads. I was talking to a lady from a workforce development agency in the Twin Cities yesterday, and we talked about the size of her caseload. And with caseloads that big, it is very difficult to donate individual time to a lot of the families that may need it. The next slide, please. So if I were to suggest a starting point for this partnership, I would suggest rallying around the idea of high expectations. The more I'm in the field and out speaking and working directly, doing technical assistance, the more that I see the impact of high expectations, or maybe better stated, the impact of low expectations on what young people with disabilities are able to do and the opportunities that they have available to them. And so high expectations really is a two-way street. On one hand, it's professionals who are responsible for helping families see that things like competitive employment are possible. But on the other hand, it's making sure that the professionals themselves have those same high expectations and that are able to convey them appropriately. Because unfortunately, many times we do see that professionals want to be the reality police, and they view it as their job to try to moderate expectations rather than to promote high expectations. They don't always see the impact of their work. And this isn't easy. For families, the messaging that they get about having a child with a disability and what that child will achieve is negative from the very beginning. From the moment you have that conversation with the doctor or a psychologist or a psychiatrist, to early childhood to special education, you don't always get a lot of positive messages about what the future is going to hold when you're a parent of a child with a significant disability. And for professionals, we know that systems are based on compliance and the severity of a disability. So the professionals are expected, on one hand, to maintain high expectations and try to overlook some of these things that they believe maybe won't be possible, and still be compliant with what their funding streams and program requires of them. And so I'm not saying any of this is easy. I'm just saying that, rallying around high expectations for me would be the place to begin. Next slide, please. So a lot of times I'm asked, when I talk about family engagement, they ask me, where specifically should we look to begin? And again, I'm addressing, professionals at this particular point. And I always say that you should think about the outcomes that you are trying to achieve. And that is your beginning point for family engagement. So we talked about the impact of families participating in IEP meetings in the 11th and 12th grade, and the positive impact that has. That can be your focus of family engagement. Our family engagement is going to focus on increasing the number of families who are active participants in the IEP process in the 11th grade or 12th grade or even beyond or even before, knowing that will yield the outcome that you're looking for. Another outcome that you could consider as the beginning point for your parent engagement is linkages to adult support. So making sure that families are linked to the possible supports that their son or daughter will need when they leave school, that can be the outcome that you are structuring your family engagement around. It could be student-led IEPs. And we know in our field, we're just terrible at youth engagement and self-advocacy. We're just not very good at it. And I think that if we were to increase the number of students who led their own IEP meeting in the last year or two of their schooling, we would see students with better set goals and better capacity around speaking up for themselves and some real skill building there. And also, we know about the increased opportunities for work experience. That'd be a great place to start your parent engagement activities, because we know about the impact of work experiences. Quality work experiences in high school, including paid jobs, are the biggest predictor to employment success for adults with or without disabilities. And so that's extremely important. Let's move on to the next slide here and talk a little bit about parents as partners. I mentioned earlier that parents want to help. Oftentimes, parents want to help. Now, I understand that a lot of you who work directly with families have run into families who seemingly do not want to be part of the process. And you're always going to have that. I don't think you can ever have 100% parent participation to the level of your satisfaction. And I think that's just a quirk of human nature, frankly, that it's just, you're not always going to get everybody on board. But most of the time, I have found that parents want what is best for their son or daughter. Sometimes as a defense mechanism, it doesn't always come out the right way. But here's some ideas that you can talk to families about, and we're gonna go over these actually. We're going to go over these a little bit more in detail here. But the last one, in terms of making connections to adult supports, that is one thing that families should know about and really take responsibility for. And they need help, though, from educators and advocates and employment program staff about understanding what supports are out there and accessing those supports in a timely manner. What we're trying to avoid is young people who get all the way through their schooling without the appropriate supports in place, and then families scrambling because they don't understand the systems, and we know that that happens all too often. So let's move on to the next slide. We're going to talk about each one of these in a little bit more detail. So families, one area that families can be a partner in the process is to help promote self-awareness and self-advocacy in their son or daughter. They play a key role in helping youth understand their own disability and helping put the youth's goals at the front and center. The youth should be in the driver's seat. This entails, families having a very difficult conversation with their son or daughter about their disability. And a lot of families avoid this. Again, this might be a human nature thing. It might be that you don't want to stress the kid out. It might be that they don't want to stress themselves out. But this I think, is a very necessary conversation to have. Because there's a lot of kids out there who are struggling and they don't know why. And if somebody would sit them down and have a real honest and respectful conversation about, this is what your disability is and this is how it impacts you. And it doesn't mean that you can't do stuff. It just means that you learn a little differently or think a little differently or function a little differently. Families should be encouraged to have those conversations. When I talk about self-advocacy and family engagement in the same sentence, a lot of people think that you can't have one and you can't have them both happen at the same time. I've had people tell me, well, we can't work on self-advocacy and work on parent engagement because the two don't mix. And I don't believe that. In fact, I think you can have parent engagement and self-advocacy at the same time. Usually parent engagement comes first. And then what you do is you focus that parent engagement on building self-advocacy skills in the son or daughter. You're very open with the families to say, the goal of what we're trying to do here is to build self-advocacy skills in your son or daughter. So down the road, they can drive the bus and make their own decisions. I would, again, imagine that most families would buy into that. Next slide, please. So we talked about the power of work experiences and the things that families can do to be able to, we're going to talk a little bit about things families can do to help find those work experiences for their son or daughter. Because we know that paid employment, volunteering to a certain extent, job shadowing, internships, information interviews, those types of things are very critical to young people understanding the world of employment and being successful in it. So the first step is always families advocating for work experiences in the IEP. This is where the advocate community comes in and helping families understand that they have a voice and helping families recognize that an IEP may be lacking in certain areas around employment. Families can certainly facilitate volunteer experiences and information interviews and internships and those types of things. There's no reason why it should be left up to the school or voc rehab to do these things. The families can also help do that. But, a note, as always, about volunteering is that volunteering is not a substitute for paid employment. It is a good work experience if done in what the young person wants to accomplish in their life. But there's just too many people out there right now who are permanent volunteers, and then they think they're working, but they're not because they're not earning a wage. And families can use their own personal networks to cultivate those work experience opportunities. Let's talk about that a little bit more on the next slide. Everybody here has a personal network. It sounds like a formal term, but it really is not. A personal network is just all the people around us that we know. It can be coworkers, it can be families and neighbors, it can be people that we go to book club with, people that we play poker with, people that we worship with. All of these people around us, places that we do business, that makes up our personal network. And we know that, finding work experiences for young people is crucial. And so families can help do that by accessing their own personal network. One example that I use is, let's say a young man, and I used this example yesterday, let's say a young man wants to work with animals, and the mom does not know of anybody who in her own network immediately that she could think of that she could, call to say, hey, can my son or daughter come over and interview you and just see what a veterinarian does? So she goes to book club and she asks, and sure enough, one of the members of her book club, her, brother-in-law is a veterinarian. And they call him and he says, yeah, great, come on over, let's do it. That is as simple as a personal network usage can be, but that is, very, very powerful. It's a help to the school, it's a help to both rehab, and it's just a great way to use the people around you to get what you want. So families need to be encouraged to play an active role in finding their son or daughter work experiences, because, getting those work experiences should be the #1 goal. Let's move on to the next one here, and we talk just a little bit about soft skills. I have heard it said that people with significant disabilities don't need to worry about soft skills, and I don't believe that at all. Soft skills are these interpersonal communication, social rule kind of skills that a lot of us acquired through expectations from our parents or things that we learned in social situations. They include being able to take work direction, showing up to work on time, showing up to work, dressed appropriately and showered, working as part of a team. Those are soft skills. And those are skills really that a lot of employers are looking for. And we gain those skills through chores in the home. Most of us did anyway. And so families need to be encouraged to do the same for their son or daughter, even if it's a small chore, even if it's difficult to pull off. The assignment of responsibility is extremely important. Things like social greetings and eye contact. Now, I know that there's certain disabilities where that is difficult. And so we need to game plan ways around it. We need to talk to our young people who might be on the autism spectrum, for example, about how do you greet somebody if somebody is greeting you randomly? How do you maintain that personal appearance and hygiene? Talking to young people and making sure they know the expectation is, before they go to work, they need to be showered and shaved and everything. And one way to do that for young people with more significant disabilities is using picture boards and task analysis to break these things down. So for example, the night before, if you know a young person is going to work, you can use a picture board to take a picture of the pants and the shirt that he's going to get up and wear. You can use a picture board to show the progression of him waking up and brushing his teeth and using the bathroom and taking a shower and drying his hair. These are all things that can be worked on to build those needed skills. And ultimately, what you want to do is help them, be successful in employment and interview situations, and consider assistive technology as a way to also be able to do that. So let's move on here. So making connections to adult supports, I talked a little bit about this earlier, but I just think it's important that educators really equip families with an understanding of what those adult supports are and help make those connections. I know a lot of school districts and places, they like to do things like transition fairs, and those are good if executed properly. But I think a lot of this connection to adult resource really needs to happen family to family, with the professional working directly with the family. And the families aren't always going to understand why they need to be connected, or they may turn down the service. We know that families turn down, county support or vocational rehabilitation support all the time. So all we're trying to do is make sure families are aware of the supports and that they're given the proper information to be able to have the conversations to access them if they want to. So I want to switch gears here a little bit and talk about the impact of having a child with a disability and how that impacts your ability as a professional to partner with families. So if I could see the next slide, please. I had a coworker at the Pacer Center that had a child with a significant disability, and she used to refer to families like hers as living complicated lives. There is no part of their life that having a child with a significant disability does not impact. And one of the goals that I often state in these types of presentations is that I really want professionals to come at engaging families from a place of understanding and empathy. If you can better understand the experience of the families that you're working with, you might be able to better understand some of the decisions that they make and some of the best ways to communicate with them. And so I think the first step of understanding is to really understand what are the real world impacts of having a child with a significant disability. We know that marriage rates can be impacted. Families who have kids with significant disabilities can be in danger of splitting apart. It doesn't always happen. I don't want to overgeneralize that piece, but they can be in danger of splitting apart. We know that families of kids with significant disabilities can have difficulty maintaining employment because of all of the supervision and maybe the medical and just the different needs that are required. I knew a lady here in Minnesota who had a son who required 24-hour nursing. And when the nurses would call in sick, it was up to her to cover that shift oftentimes because finding a nurse is very difficult. That meant that she was unable to actually go into work when that happened. And it seemed to happen certainly more often than she would have wanted it to. That impacted, without an employer who's willing to be flexible, that would have been a very difficult situation. Finding health care, finding mental health care, finding the supports in general that the young person needs can be very, very stressful. I mentioned that I'm a sibling of a 40-year-old young man who's on the autism. Well, maybe not so young anymore. I'm not very young anymore. So he's 8 years my junior. And he's my brother, and it's just he and I and my mom and dad. And he requires supports to be able to live in the community. He lives in an apartment that is supported by a housing agency. He takes accessible transportation to his job. He does get some job coaching and job supports. And maintaining those supports and working with those supports are very difficult. It's time consuming for my mom and dad. And then social relationships for families. If you have a young person with a disability, your son or daughter, you don't get to go out much. Finding babysitters or we have a family in the neighborhood here. Like I mentioned, I live in the Minneapolis, suburban Minneapolis area, and we know a family who has a young lady on the autism spectrum. She's pretty profoundly impacted, and she's a runner, and she's a magician, and she knows various ways to manage to get out of the house. And it's very difficult for that family to be able to go out together and find anybody who can watch this young lady, with full confidence that she's not going to, sneak out of the house. Let's talk specifically about employment, though. The back slide, please. There we go. I've got a friend who's a longtime employment agency worker. He just retired. His name is Don Lavin. He's kind of a nationally known proponent of employment first and employment for people with disabilities. And he and I were talking one day about, the families who are apprehensive to explore competitive employment and how employment providers often point to these apprehensive families as being the problem as to why, they can't find people jobs. And it occurred to us that if you put everything on a bell curve like we did here on the slide, you'd find that it really is a relatively small percentage of families that are absolutely not ready to explore employment. In fact, the majority of the families are going to fall into either the darker blue middle or the far right. It's either tell me more about this. I'm not sold on it. I have a lot of questions, but tell me a little more about this. I'm not going to discount it. Or they're already sold and they might be pushing the employment program or the school harder than the school is pushing themselves. And so our goal is to, first of all, be patient with the families on the left and continually bring up the prospect of paid competitive employment as an option and try to loosen their stance on it. In the middle, our goal is to provide families with information on supports and employment so they can make an informed decision. And on the right, our goal is to provide those families with the supports so they can use that energy and motivation to help build skills in their son or daughter and help find training and supports for a lifetime of employment. Next slide, please. So a lot of work that I have been doing lately nationally has been around this idea of apprehensive families. You know, families who are apprehensive to explore competitive employment for any given reason. And here's a list of reasons I think a lot of families are apprehensive to explore, including, you know, a fear of disruption of the services and supports that they already have in place, a mistrust of the system and wariness of professionals. If you have a child with a significant disability and that disability has been present at birth, you're a family that has had professionals in your life the whole time, telling you one thing and telling you another thing, and here's this program and here's that program. And after a while, some families can just get a little bit weary of the whole thing. Families often cite vulnerability and safety as an issue, and I think it's valid. I hear a lot of people that want to kind of poo-poo that notion. The families are overprotective. But if something goes wrong and it all hits the fan, it's usually the families that are left to pick up the pieces. And so unless you're the person who's going to pick up the pieces, I would encourage you not to push super hard on this idea of letting go, unless you have all the supports in place necessary to make sure that they are comfortable with the risks that are being taken. You know, plain old, some families just do not believe that people with significant disabilities can work. They can't see it. It's not that they're doing anything wrong. It's not that they're bad people. It's just they cannot envision it in their mind that their son or daughter with this impactful disability is going to be able to contribute in employment. Some families are really stuck on this Social Security benefits piece. They worked really hard to get their son or daughter on benefits. They were probably told in some way, shape, or form that it would be the magic bullet. You know, get your kid on benefits, and then now we're here saying that actually working is better. And it's tough. It's a tough thing to navigate. And I'm sure that you've heard others too, as we go through it. And so, you know, I think it's important to work through this apprehension. And we wanted to talk specifically about employment today. And I wanted to give you just a few strategies to be able to work through some of this apprehension that you may see as a professional. So the first strategy is relationship building. You know, I think that families really want to know, as I stated earlier, do you know their son or daughter? Do you know what makes them unique? Do you know what makes them vulnerable? Have you taken the time to build the relationship with the family and that son or daughter so you understand them and can provide them with the best service? If families don't feel like that relationship is being established, they're going to discount you and they're going to try to do things themselves. And oftentimes what that means is, okay, forget employment. He can go to the workshop or he can go to the day program. Building relationships takes time and effort. Not everybody is good at it. Just because a person works in the human services or education doesn't mean they're automatically good at building relationships with families. And so this might require some mentoring or some training to help people build this particular skill. The next strategy that we like to talk about oftentimes is helping families see their son or daughter in a different way. So if families do not perceive their son or daughter as being able to be employed in the community, one thing that we can do is we can show them that there are people with significant disabilities who are employed in the community all the time, every day, everywhere. And let's build up our knowledge about that young person so we can show the families that there is an employee in there. One of the tools that we use at Transcend often is something called the positive personal profile. But we just had a couple of weeks ago, the folks from University of Missouri, Kansas City come out and do a charting the life course training for us. And so we know that there's a lot of tools out there to help families gather positive information about their son or daughter. And really the goal is to take that information and to translate it into how they are going to find jobs, using that information. So let's take the next slide. I just wanted to show you an example of the positive personal profile that we use. It's a very simple form. Most of these categories, again, are all about positivity. We're trying to find the positive skills and traits and experiences and supports that a young person has and translate all of that into where they would be good on the job. And the next thing that I want to show you is the vision statement. So you can use the information on the positive personal profile to create a vision statement like the one that's on the screen right now. The young man on the left, his name is Andy Meredith, and this is his vision statement. He's a young man from Georgia, and he and his mom put this together. And I just absolutely love this concept because it allows people to really show themselves. What are the dreams? What do I want to have happen? What does not work for me? What are my strengths? What am I doing right now? I think this would be great as a resume. I think this would be great to show people who are new working with somebody. I think that, this is one strategy. If you were able to work with a family to produce a vision statement for a young person, that would really help them see their young person in a different way. The next strategy is benefits counseling. And I know that, a lot of times families get really stuck on this benefits idea. They think that it's the be all end all, and it really is not. We also know that a lot of families rely on that SSI check, which is, I think, a completely different matter in getting families to see, we want you to give up this income because we want your son or daughter to work in the community. That's not always going to be something that families buy into. So what I do is just encourage professionals to partner with a CWIC, which is a Certified Work Incentives Counselor, or a WIPA, which is a Work Incentives Planning and Assistance Project. You could Google both of those terms and you would find the project in Massachusetts. I think what I heard yesterday is that MRS provides some of this benefits counseling, and there's also a project called Work Without Limits in Massachusetts that does some of this stuff. So providing benefits counseling, I think, is very, very important. Quickly, the next one is, if families are worried about what's going to happen to their son or daughter during the off hours, then create a plan with families to show them what is going to happen to their son or daughter when they're not working. And there's a movement afoot called Meaningful Day, which means that if we know that young people with significant disabilities aren't going to work 40 hours a week, how do we fill the rest of their days with things that are meaningful and things that they want to do? But it also then allows the families to be able to go and maintain their own jobs. And so really what I'm encouraging you to do is answer the question, what happens if something goes wrong? And what happens during these off hours that we're talking about? And trying to structure something that really makes some sense. This involves blending and braiding of resources, which we're not always super good at. But I think that is kind of the next frontier in disability supports, is putting a lot of these pieces together. The final thing that I have is something that I talked about earlier, which is staff training. Staff don't always think that it's their job to be able to do some of these things. I think that they need to be held accountable to the idea. And I think that a little training needs to happen so they can help build better relationships with families. You can't expect somebody to do something they're not trained to do. That's really the point there. So I just want you to take a moment to consider a couple of the questions on the next slide. I apologize for my dog barking. We just got him a little while ago, and he seems to like to protect the house. So if I could get the next slide, please. So does your messaging to families about employment convey high expectations that all people can work? Does your current model of partnering with families make them active and respected members of the team? Are you finding families of youth with significant disabilities being resistant to considering competitive employment? And then just on your own, after the webinar, I'd love for you to think about 3 action steps that you can take right now to improve your partnerships with family. So that being said, I would be open to some questions. Carrie, if you would do me a favor and skip ahead 2 slides to the resources and contact information, we can open it up to some questions that people might have based on the information that was presented.
Okay, anybody have any questions? You can just chat them in. Thanks, Sean. That was a good presentation. Enjoyed it.
So I wanted to, while we're getting the questions, I wanted to address this idea of encouraging families to try risks. I know that was a question that came up before the presentation, and I don't think that we should ever be okay with forcing families to do something that they're not comfortable to do. But I also believe that a lot of families need to be coaxed or gently coaxed into seeing that failure is not the end of the world. In fact, failure is how we learn. And so one thing that I talk to employment programs and educators about a lot is a concept of negotiating the risk. If you start small and build up, and the example I use is public transportation. Let's say that you're an employment program provider and you believe that the young person can take public transportation to the job, but the parent does not believe that that's possible. How do you break it down into small enough steps where you can negotiate that risk with the family? For example, you can say, all right, I understand that you have some apprehensions. Would you be okay if I rode the bus with your son a few times just so he could see the route that he's going to be taking? Okay, yeah, I'd be okay with that. I'd be there the whole time. You know, I will not leave him alone. Are you okay with that? Family says okay. Then after that is done, after a little while, you could say, how about if I'm with him at the beginning of the route and I have a staff person at the end of the route, what if we do that and allow him to ride the bus independently between the 2 stops? Would you be okay with that? And you're really respecting the family's apprehension and fears because they're valid, but you're working to break down what you want to see accomplished into little enough steps that they are comfortable with what is going on. So I wanted to address that idea of letting go and the idea of risk taking, because I know that that's something that professionals deal with. Did we get anything else question-wise?
Yes. Actually, Robin has a question. I believe that clients and families are most resistant due to SSI, SSDI changes. Do you think this will ever change? They do have loss of some income in SSI cases, not so much with SSDI, so you could make a good amount at first.
Yep. And you know, it really is a double-edged sword, isn't it? Because the benefit on SSI at first, the monthly benefit doesn't look too bad. But what we know, for example, is that the rent around the country has outpaced the SSI maximum monthly benefit. So you can't even rent an apartment in most places, let alone have cable, let alone have food, let alone, you know, Uber to a movie. So the conversation with families becomes, what kind of quality of life do you want your son or daughter to have in the community? Because frankly, living on SSI is not going to provide that. Now, a lot of families supplement the income of their son or daughter. And so, or a lot of families rely on that SSI income. It tends to be one or the other. And so, you know, do I think this is ever going to change? I think it's going to change gradually, because I think we're steering away from advocating for families to get on benefits. When I first started at the Pacer Center, for example, we were advocating for people and doing workshops teaching people how to get on SSI benefits. And now we understand that SSI is not, you know, it really is a sentence to poverty. And so if we change our practices on a wide scale on how we're messaging those benefits to families, maybe we can get families to see that there are other ways to consider their son or daughter's future and the role that benefits will play in it.
Okay, thank you. How about anybody else? I was just curious at the less, okay, actually Jessica has a question. This may be more of a question for service coordinators, but I'm wondering how we get adult service providers involved earlier in the transition process for young people. We have more success building buy-in and developing relationships with families the earlier we can be involved.
That is, I think, a wonderful question / task for the Massachusetts Partnership for Transition to Employment. The grant that is sponsoring this webinar and that we work, Carrie and I both work, with, that sounds to me like a wonderful, task to consider. How do you get buy-in from service providers a little bit earlier? I'm not as intimately familiar with Massachusetts and its service provider community, but I do know that it is a big shift for service providers to be involved earlier because they're just not used to doing it. And we are, only within 4 or 5 years of a lot of these new rules being implemented, that they should be at the table a little bit sooner. So that's a great question, I think. I don't have an answer to it, but it is a great question.
Yeah, I agree, Sean, that it is a great question. And I just wanted to share a couple things that we've noticed that through the MPTE as promising practices. There's a bunch of groups throughout the state that have transition coalitions. And so it is educators, it's adult service agencies, it's state service agencies who get together on a monthly or quarterly basis and share information with each other. So that's promising because we're learning more about each other. Also, last year, we were able to bring out a gentleman from the Beach Center, Michael Waymeyer, who did a whole day training on self-determination and employment and that sort of thing. And in the audience were people from service providers and educators and state agencies. So I think we have a lot of work to be done. And I think it's a great note that we're going to look at seeing how we can develop this even more. So thank you.
Yeah, collaboration really takes everybody. And collaboration is a lot more difficult to do than anybody ever imagines. And so whoever asked that question, you are on the front lines of getting people to see that this is beneficial. And so keep tooting that horn, that we're all in this together and that, all of us together are going to provide these supports to families and youth, in a much more coordinated way than if we have to go chasing everybody down.
Sure. Okay. So anybody else? Wait a minute or so for a question. Meanwhile, I want to let everybody know that I will be sending you a copy of the presentation today. And also at the end of the webinar, you will be rerouted to a brief 5-question SurveyMonkey on how your webinar experience was and what you thought of the webinar today. And we really encourage you to do that because it teaches us so much. We love the feedback on what people thought as well as ideas for the future. So I think we're set. I want to thank Sean Roy, our presenter today, for a terrific webinar, and all of you who stayed on to review it today. So hope everybody has a great day and that you catch us again. All right. Bye-bye.